Our liberties we prize, and our rights we will maintain. This is Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast, where we tell stories about the contribution Iowans and the state of Iowa has made to advance the civil rights movement. Past stories are being told, present actions will be highlighted, and preparation for the future will be discussed. Here is your host, Erick Nganyange.
Welcome to the Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. My guest today is William S. Morris. William is one of the contributors of the book Outside In, African American History in Iowa from 1838 to 2000. His contribution, he wrote Chapter 5 in the book, Black Iowans in the Defense of the Nation, from 1863 to 1991. William is also a grandson of Iowa's legend, J.B. Morris. William, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Talk to me how this chapter came about and why did you want to write about military?
I grew up, my father and my grandfather were Army officers. I had two uncles. My mother's brothers were U.S. Navy. When I grew up, there was a lot of Westerns on TV and World War II shows and that kind of thing. And I couldn't understand why there were no African Americans in these shows. And, I said, I see all these cowboys. Where are the black cowboys? Or did they even exist? It was my grandfather that showed me that, yes, there were black cowboys, there were black soldiers. And he was the one that originally got me interested in African American history, particularly military history. When I was a young boy, he would pay me to go down the basement of his shop, and I had to put all these Iowa bystanders in chronological order. And so I started in the 1920s, and I basically read the entire history of African Americans from the 1920s until the 1960s or early 70s. I always thought that I was going to be a soldier. I didn't. I came out too late for Vietnam. I graduated high school in May of 75, and the Vietnam War was over by then, and the military was downsizing. But I always respected soldiers and sailors, Marines and airmen, and I wanted their story to be told. My father had another friend, matter of fact, our associate superintendent of schools in Des Moines, James Bowman, was a Tuskegee Airman. I knew black tankers. My uncle Virgil Dixon from Chicago, originally from Des Moines. He was recon platoon commander of the 758th in Italy. My father was the first black U.S. Army officer to command white troops in combat. That was in World War II in the Pacific. He was an Alamo Scout, which was the forerunner of the Army's Green Berets. And I have copies of orders, ordering her, top secret orders, ordering him to travel by water to report to Alamo Force Headquarters. I have lots of photographs of him with his integrated unit. There were white men, there were Indonesians, Japanese Nisi, Filipinos, other African Americans. These guys are all in this unit. They fought behind enemy lines. They would go ashore prior to an invasion, and they would scout Japanese positions. He had a little, I call it secret agent camera that he used, but he said in the hot, wet jungle environments, the photographs were often of poor quality. So he had to memorize everything. All the Japanese, he'd count the number of soldiers, machine gun positions, mortar positions, number of troops, whether there were any American or Allied POWs in the area. He had to come back and draw a complete map out of memory to his superior officers, and they would use that as a basis for their invasion. They would scout beach positions, were there any aircraft present, that sort of thing. So it was a very hazardous and a very dangerous job. But like I say, he was awarded 4 Bronze Stars by the U.S. Army for that. He was, like every African American, I think we kind of have a love-hate relationship with our country, but he always told me that experience, and that opened a lot of doors for him. My father came back and completed law school. He was the first African American assistant county attorney in Iowa in 1950, and his first criminal prosecutor. He was, like I say, he was JC's Young Man of the Year in 1950, went on to become a very successful trial lawyer. Was active in the Republican Party, ran for office unsuccessfully in 1964. These men and women who served in the military were the backbone of the civil rights movement. They spearheaded westward expansion after the Civil War. They led the increase in black business and things after World War I. And in World War II, That generation spearheaded black, the desegregation of the suburbs, blacks entering into education, law, medicine, all areas of endeavor, the sciences. They're the ones who spearheaded the what later became Reconstruction in the South. They were active in the Republican Party. Advances that they were able to make were just incredible. My mother, Arlene Roberts Morris from Moline, Illinois, she typed the plans for the atomic bombs, top secret atomic
I
bombs
saw
at
that.
the University of Chicago Department of Metallurgy in 1944 and 45. And she worked under a black scientist by the name of Ernest Wilkins Jr. from Chicago. They called the Negro Genius. He had gotten his bachelor's degree at 18, I think, and his master's at 19 and his PhD at 20.
Wow. How long did it take you to put this chapter together?
The research that I think I started in, I think this book was published in 2001, so I'm going to think we started around 1994, 95. It took a number of years to put it together, and I tell you, I got calls from white people all over the state of Iowa saying, we had a black soldier up here, Civil War veteran, Buffalo soldier. They would send me information. I got a lot of information on black Civil War veterans from the Newton area. It was just astounding. And I was blessed because I had documents from my grandfather and my father. My grandfather served for 6 months in combat from May to November 1918 in World War I. He was a second lieutenant. He was a scout. He commanded Scout Sniper Platoon. He wasn't in the transport corps or anything like that. He was a sniper. He commanded the Scout Sniper Platoon, Headquarters Company, 366th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division. And matter of fact, I still have his sniper's manual in his writing, in his handwriting. I've transcribed it years ago because the pencil and the ink were starting to fade, but I still have that.
Your grandfather and your father was kind of influential for you to jump on this project.
Oh, yeah. In history, and like I said, so many of these men and women went on to do other things. Just from that group of officers in World War I, you had men who founded black fraternities. You had black men who founded the National Bar Association, National Medical Association. The caliber of these men was just extraordinary.
You talked to your father and your grandfather about this. At that time, the mistreatment of a black man in this country was a little bit high. Why did this man felt the need to serve the country that did not serve them?
I asked that question of almost every black veteran that I interviewed. I said, why did you fight for a country that discriminated against you, that lynched black men, that raped black women, that threw black men in jail for little or nothing? And every one of them told me, I did not fight for an America as it then existed. I fought for an America for what it could be, a land of opportunity for my children and my grandchildren. And they said, even with its flaws, America was still the best country for African Americans. These are men who grew up in Jim Crow, the time of Jim Crow. And, they had seen men lynched. My grandfather told me, and my grandmother, they both separately saw black men lynched in Georgia and Virginia back around the turn of the last century. And, but it was really when Alex Haley came out with Roots in the 1970s, I think that was the impetus for a lot of African Americans to start talking to their elders about their own family histories. My wife and I have worked on an ancestry page that we have for our families. And my mother's family was also very distinguished. My paternal grandfather, J.B. Morris's parents were both born into slavery. My grandfather grew up in very humble beginnings, but he went on to accomplish quite a few things. And my dad grew up in the Great Depression, as did my mother, but they went on to accomplish great things. My mother she had which was unusual in itself. She had a college scholarship at the University of Iowa in 1944, which is very unusual for young black girls. And she graduated in 1948, married my father, had me and my brothers, went back to school and got her master's degree in 1967 from Drake University and became Iowa's first black licensed clinical psychologist. And she worked in mental health at Broad Hospital under Dr. Sidney Sands. And she had that job for over 30 years before she retired. And there are a lot of other black men and women who came. The military training had given them the discipline and the belief in themselves that when they left the military service, they went on to do great things in civilian society.
Wow. You mentioned something, and I want you to add a little bit into it in the chapter. And I'm not going to, because I wanted people to go and read this chapter, so I'm not going to touch everything on it. But you mentioned something I don't know why I never thought about. You said black soldiers were getting executed upon capture or surrender.
Yes, in the Civil War,
according to the Southern state laws during Civil War.
Yeah.
And even the white officers in command of black officers were getting executed.
That's right. That's right. And you can see that to some degree at the end of the movie Glory with Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington. Right at the end, they had warned, the South had warned the North that if you send these black soldiers, if we capture them, we're either going to kill them or sell them back into slavery, and we'll also kill their white officers. So Robert Gould Shaw was the commander of the 54th Massachusetts, and they buried him with his black soldiers in a mass grave after the Battle of Battery Wagner, in 1864, I believe it was. I tell the story of James Daniel Gardner, who was originally from Virginia. He later settled in Iowa, became a Catholic missionary. His unit, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor, along with, I think, 8 other black soldiers at the battle, deep bottom outside of Richmond, Virginia.
Was James Gardner the first one to win?
Oh, no. The first Medal of Honor was in the Civil War. We had 18 black soldiers and sailors in the Civil War. The first one, I think, might have been from the 54th Massachusetts. So there were a couple of there. There were, because we had, I think, 18 black infantry regiments. We had black cavalry regiments, black artillery regiments. And these men, particularly as the war wound down, you saw more commitment of black soldiers to the Union military effort, and they performed very bravely. And because of their service and sacrifice, that's the reason that Congress created the Buffalo Soldiers. In 1866, they authorized what was then the 40th, I think it was the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st Infantry Regiments, and they were later consolidated into the 24th and 25th and the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments.
Okay, so the Buffalo Soldier was just created strictly for black soldiers.
That's right. And the Indian War, the white officers and black enlisted and NCOs. And they fought against the Ute and the Paiute, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Apache, the Comanche. But they helped defeat the toughest Indian nations in the West.
All these black soldiers in Iowa, they were trained at Fort Des Moines?
Yes, the soldiers of World War I, both there at Fort Des Moines and at Camp Dodge. And Camp Dodge is up north. There was a separate training camp there, and so there were black soldiers from all over the country, from the south, the east, the north, and the west, that all came there not only for enlisted training, but also for officers training. And that's where my grandfather was there, yes.
Was that the only training camp in the nation?
Yeah, those two.
Oh, really?
Now, later on, I heard there was another one at Fort Meade in Maryland in 1918. So there were a few black officers trained there. Charles Young, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young, was supposed to be a general, our first black general in World War I, because he had been the third black graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He had served in the 10th Cavalry, I believe, and also served under Black Jack Pershing and the punitive expedition to Mexico in 1916 when they were coming after Pancho Villa. But the Army forcibly retired him without explanation, saying he was physically unfit, even though he had ridden a horse from Ohio to Washington, D.C. and back to show his physical fitness. They still discharged him. So we didn't get another black general until B.O. Davis Sr. in 1939. He was our first black general. His son, B.O. Davis Jr., who commanded the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, he was the second black general. He was in the Air Force, and that was in 1958. And it was a direct result of the service of the Tuskegee Airmen that the Air Force desegregated as soon as it did, because it had a legacy of black officers and service. We have a number of men who were three war warriors from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
Who created the Fort Des Moines? Was it the Congress?
Well, it was, yes, the War Department and the Congress created Fort Des Moines in 1901. It was supposed to be a cavalry post, obviously for white soldiers, and it was initially. But after there was a regiment of white cavalry that served there for a few months, and then black soldiers from the 24th Infantry were the second group there. And they arrived in the winter, and their job was guarding military prisoners. That was an overload from Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. So the second unit there at Fort Des Moines were black infantrymen. And then later on, in 1917, the Congress and the War Department approved the 17th Provisional Training Regiment for black officers in World War I, and that's where my grandfather was commissioned as second lieutenant.
The reason this camp the training camp was open, does this all go back to the 1925, the military study? What is great experiment, what they call it?
Yeah, it was a great experiment.
Great experiment?
Yeah, that was the black officers training.
To see if the black officers are cut for the job?
That's right. Now, there had been black officers in the Civil War and in the Indian Wars. There was a black officer that won a Medal of Honor, a captain. He was the first black officer to win a Medal of Honor. That was during the Civil War. But there were about, I'm going to guess, 20, 25 black officers in the Civil War, particularly from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Regiments, Louisiana Native Guards. Those men were all mixed race. Many of them had white fathers and black mothers. They'd been educated in Europe. They came back. They had money. Major Francis Dumas was the executive officer of the 1st Regiment Louisiana Native Guards in 1863 and 1864. And although most of those black officers in that unit were later forced out by white racism and the commanding general, but they set a precedent. And we had 2 black officers with the Buffalo Soldiers. John H. Alexander was the second. Henry Ossian Flipper was the first. They served with the 9th and 10th. And even Flipper was unfairly treated, and he was court-martialed and forced to leave the military. They kind of set him up.
Now, Flipper was the first black to graduate from West Point?
That is correct.
Was that him?
That's correct, 1877. Yeah. He was heavily ostracized.
That's interesting.
His instructors would not speak to him except to give him his assignments. The other white candidates would not speak to him. He was ostracized and segregated, but he still made it. He still graduated. He still got his commission.
Yeah, and West Point was established when, like 1802, 1805?
Oh, no, I think West Point was established... I think it was established on the grounds of, it was on the grounds of one of the old slave plantations there. But I think it was established in the 1820s, I think. Because I know Robert E. Lee and U.S. Grant went there and a number of others.
Even I did not know this. I mean, this is beside to our conversation. Iowa first Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court actually graduate from West Point, Charles Mason.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and he was in the same class actually with Robert E. Lee.
Yeah. I
want to go back to that military study of 1925. Yeah. What was the rationale to do this study first?
The issue was that there was always a fear by white Americans that blacks trained in war with guns would turn the guns on white people. That was always a fear. That's why they tried to minimize the number of black officers. But they couldn't deny that blacks had performed bravely in the Revolution, free black men and escaped slaves. And that was our first integrated war, was the Revolution. Black and white fought side by side. And we wouldn't see that again until Korea. The military was dominated by a lot of Southern generals, and they had these ideas of black inferiority, that blacks, they were physically strong, they could serve in infantry, they were not suitable to fly airplanes or operate tanks. Because the U.S. military was undergoing a great technological change then. What had happened in World War I, we saw the first use of massed heavy artillery, airplanes, tanks, submarines, battleships, that kind of thing. They didn't have any problem with blacks functioning as subordinates, as mess men or, truck drivers, that kind of thing. They did have a problem with blacks in combat with sophisticated weapons. Initially, even though they opened up the Air Corps, which at that time was the U.S. Army Air Corps for black pilots, the Air Corps would not recruit any because they said they didn't have any facilities for them. And Patton himself, although George Patton later became a great believer in the black tankers, initially he didn't feel that black men had the mental capacity to operate a tank. But the 761st And World War II would break the German ring around Bastogne, and the 758th fought bravely against the Germans in Italy. So there, the issue of black men being able to do these things, it was destroyed by superior performance. The Tuskegee Airmen showed that black men could fly planes successfully against the enemy. Airmen that shot down the first two Me-262 jet fighters that were down by Allied pilots. And it was directly due to their performance, as I say, that the Air Force desegregated after Truman issued the executive order in 1948 desegregating the military. The Air Force had already done a lot of that. Right at the end of World War II, because of the great fear of casualties as the Allies pushed into Germany, the Germans are fighting desperately and to the death. They started integrating black rifle platoons into white companies called Fifth Company men. There's a book called Blood for Dignity that's out. It talks about these men. They all earned their combat infantry badges, and they all fought bravely as the Allies pushed into Germany in 1944 and 45. The caliber of these men and what they did afterward. A lot of these guys that came out of Des Moines because they'd gone to integrated schools. Remember, the Iowa Supreme Court desegregated the state public schools in Iowa in 1868. Yep. And that's directly due to the service of the first Iowa Volunteers of African descent. These black men fought in the Civil War. And when they came back, Iowa recognized the black man's right to vote in 1868. That was 2 years before the 15th Amendment was passed. And they took the white-only language out of the state constitution in 1884. So, Iowa had a great history. It was always a performance. Writing about the Buffalo Soldiers went off the road. It was the superior performance and the solidarity born of racial prejudice that these black men accomplished what they did. They fought bravely because whites thought black men were cowards. They would throw down their guns and run at the first sight of the enemy. Well, you can ask the enemy about that. You can ask the Native American, you can ask the Germans, you can ask the Japanese, you can ask the North Koreans and the Chinese and everybody else, the Viet Cong. Black soldiers fought very bravely everywhere.
What was that? What was the Great Experiment? What was that all about?
Well, there were two of them. One of the Tuskegee Experiment was also called the Great Experiment because it was felt, the first one was whether black men could be trained as officers in World War I. That was the first Great Experiment. Yeah. And a lot of people think they put it back at one of the camps in Iowa so that the Eastern Press, if it did fail, the Eastern Press wouldn't get a hold of it right away. But it was a success, as was Camp Dodge. Yes, there were some issues there, but these black men fought very bravely. I think 400,000 black men volunteered for service in World War I, and it was over 1 million in World War II. The Navy integrated its officer corps in 1944, I believe, with the Golden 13. You had black officers who were pilots with the Tuskegee Airmen. You had black infantry and tank officers. My father, like I said, was graduated first in his class from Officers Candidate School in Camp Columbia in Brisbane, Australia in June of 1943. And Major General Walter Kruger specifically requested him for First Corps Intelligence and assigned him to the Alamo Scouts, who were the forerunners of the Army's Green Berets. So my father was the first black man in U.S. Army Special Forces. He was also the first black man to command white troops in combat.
What was the difference between these two training camps in Iowa, the Fort Des Moines and the Camp Dodge?
Camp Dodge primarily trained non-commissioned officers and enlisted men. Fort Des Moines trained primarily officers. You had black captains, first lieutenants, and second lieutenants from Fort Des Moines. Most of the camp, although they did do what was now called advanced infantry training, that was done at Camp Dodge. But most of those guys trained at Camp Dodge were enlisted men and non-commissioned officers. There were some officers there, but most of them were trained at Fort Des Moines. Originally, the federal government was not going to call any soldiers into Union service in the Civil War, but the sheer need for numbers of men necessitated it, particularly when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a given that black soldiers would be called into Union service, primarily because of the huge human losses in the early Civil War campaigns. The North suffered enormous losses on the battlefield. So these black men came in and fought very bravely. Again, they almost suicidally sometimes in their charges of the black men who served in the Civil War There were, I think, 27,000 casualties, dead, wounded, and a lot of those guys who died of disease, not just of Confederate shot and shell. They had to leave several wounded men on the battlefield that could not be moved, and the Confederates murdered all of them. But that was just a fact of life for the Civil War. If the Confederates didn't kill you, they'd sell you into slavery in the South. Even with that, black men still fought. That was just the part of the deal. You just had to accept that and go fight.
Supposedly there were about 1,200 black candidate trained at the Fort Des Moines.
Approximately. Only about half of those guys received commissions. I think about 639 received commissions. The Army delayed the issuance of commissions so long, a lot of the men left the camp and went home. But for those that stayed, including my grandfather, there were 639 captains, second lieutenants, and first lieutenants, and they went on to serve in France in World War I.
Now, your father,
yes.
J.B. Morris Jr., was an intelligence officer.
That is correct.
Was that like a spy?
Well, in a manner of speaking, because he was sent to the Alamo Scouts, he deployed behind enemy lines. So the job, he had an integrated unit. They would deploy before an invasion in Japanese-held islands to recon. So they would count the number of Japanese soldiers, mortar positions, machine gun positions, any presence of any aircraft or armor, and also see if there were any Allied POWs. He participated in the Cabanatuan raid in the Philippines to free American prisoners there. Like I say, he was awarded 4 Bronze Stars for his role in the invasions of the Philippines and Leyte, New Guinea, Solomons, and I think it was the Dutch East Indies. But he had quite a distinguished combat career when he left the service.
And he was training in, is that Bisbee?
Yeah.
How you call that town in Australia?
He was trained. It was called Camp Columbia in Brisbane, Australia. And he graduated in June 1943, number 1 in his class, over 580 white men and 19 black men. He was number 1, and he was specifically requested by Major General Walter Kruger for the Alamo Scouts and the Intelligence Corps. My father told me they had a kind of a forced march at the end of their mini Hell Week. And so it was a 25-mile forced march, 12 and a half out, 12 and a half back. Only 4 men finished it, and he came in first. Even though my father was not a large man, he was 5'8", I think, and 185 pounds. He was carrying 3 35-pound field packs, 3 Springfield bolt-action rifles with bayonets, and 3 of the old-style World War I helmets on his head. So he was showing he could carry the load of 3 men. So like I say, he graduated number 1, and his exam scores were excellent. He had gone to integrated schools, and he'd already finished his bachelor's degree at the University of Iowa before Uncle Sam called, and he had an Army ROTC scholarship to the University of Iowa in 1937, and he graduated, I think, in 1941. The Army let him graduate and then sent him to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for basic training, and he rose to the rank of sergeant, and then was later selected for Intelligence Corps and Officers Candidate School. But he had also performed undercover for the U.S. Army Intelligence, the Detroit, Michigan area, investigating possible Japanese subversion of black factory workers by the Japanese Black Dragon Society. And I didn't know anything about that till a friend of my father's, who I ran into, mentioned it to me when I was doing this chapter. He called me and told me that he had run into my dad in Detroit, and he had told him to keep it hush-hush, but he was investigating Japanese subversion amongst possible with black factory workers, but he didn't find any evidence of it. So he reported back to U.S. Army Intelligence Command, and because of the success of his operation there, that's when he was sent to the Officers Candidate School. So
the military was desegregated in 1948.
Yeah, officially, yes, in 1948. President Harry Truman did that, but the Air Force had already, because of the service of the Tuskegee Airmen, the Air Force, when they broke off, it was the U.S. Army Air Corps in World War II. They broke off and formed the separate Air Force in 1946, I think. And because of that, Tuskegee Airmen, black men like Chappie James and B.O. Davis Jr. rose to officer. They were already officers. They rose to general's rank. B.O. Davis Jr. was the first black general in the Air Force in 1958. And then Chappie James became our first black 4-star general in the 1970s. And he flew the F-4 Phantom in Vietnam. He was the 3-war airman. He was World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. their experience, their sacrifice, and their hard work. That's what propelled them to great accomplishments, whether they stayed in the military or they entered civilian life. Because that World War II generation of men and women, that's who spearheaded the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Most of those men and women were military veterans.
I wanna read something you wrote on chapter 5 on the book Outside In, and I wanna see, since you wrote this chapter a long time ago, I wanna see if you still stand behind these words.
Go ahead.
You say perhaps the greatest contribution by Black Iowans in sheer numbers to the war effort came through service with the Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, 332 Fighter Group. 13 Black Iowans served in the Black Air Units, both stateside and overseas, a rate higher per capita than blacks from any other state in the nation.
Correct. That is correct, sir. And I knew a lot of these guys. And again, that goes back to the 1868 decision by the Iowa Supreme Court to desegregate the public schools. Because these black men had been to school with whites, they had received the highest available quality of education. They immediately moved up the ranks in the military. And that was, nowhere was that more evident than in the Tuskegee Airmen, because it was extremely competitive. These black men were the cream of the crop. They excelled, and in many cases, they were more qualified to teach than their white instructors. A lot of these guys had already had their private pilot's licenses and had been taught to fly by Queen Bess Armstrong, who was a black woman pilot outside Chicago back in the 1920s. They destroyed stereotypes. They proved that black men could operate planes and do it successfully. Bob Williams from Ottumwa shot down 2 German fighters on the same day. All those men received the Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak-Leaf clusters. Like I say, Luther Smith went on to become the first African-American hired as an aerospace engineer by General Electric in 1951. And he served in the 99th was the 99th Pursuit was the original black fighter squadron. They started in North Africa. Later on, they were combined with 4 others to form the 332nd Fighter Group. And they were officially known as the Tuskegee Airmen because, of course, they trained at Tuskegee, Alabama. And they compiled a distinguished combat record. Now, they said they never lost a bomber in all their time escorting bombers over here, but I found that wasn't quite true. There was one mission where they didn't catch up to their bombers soon enough, and several of the bombers were shot down, but that was the only time that I found that they lost any bombers to the German flak or German fighters. I'm coming out with a revised version of Black Iowans in Defense of the Nation. I've added some things that I didn't have in the first chapter, including the story of a white bomber pilot from Iowa, or bomber crewman, I should say, whose plane went down over Yugoslavia. And he talks about how the Tuskegee Airmen were escorting him that day, and his bomber was hit by a flak, but the pilot made what they call a dead stick landing. So he crash landed the plane, and all the men survived. He said the Tuskegee Airmen flew over them and counted them and radioed in for a rescue bird. And so the Tito's partisans had hidden the bomber crews until the rescue plane came in and rescued them a few days later. And he said a week later they were back flying bombing missions over Germany. But that story is in there. The white man from Iowa was a fascinating story. But
talking about the Tuskegee, this is another piece I did not know until I read in your book. The architect of the Tuskegee Airmen construction was from Iowa.
Right. Archie A. Alexander was a good friend of my grandfather's.
Yeah.
He was the first black architect from Iowa. He had an integrated business. His business partner was white. He was a multimillionaire. He built electric plants and buildings in Iowa City and bridges that many of them are still standing in Iowa City. He was given the contract to build the facilities at Moton Field in Tuskegee, Alabama. That's where the black pilots trained. So Alexander got there. Interestingly enough, he was an All-American defensive tackle at the University of Iowa. He was a big man. And he died before I was born, but I remember his widow, Audra Alexander, was a great woman. I remember her very well. We'd always stop there first on Halloween because she always had the best treats when I was a kid. He bought a house where the Mr. and Mrs. Blanton later lived. And it was a beautiful house. I've been in it many times. That was in 1950, and his neighbors burned a cross on his yard and circulated a petition that he not be allowed to move into that house, because in those days, a lot of they had what they call racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of real estate. And that would say that this house or this land may not be sold to a black person or a person of colored descent. And so Archie Alexander took his case to the Iowa Supreme Court and won it. And that's what rendered these what they call racially restrictive covenants. They were no longer legal in Iowa. So Alexander bought his house and moved in, formed us hopefully half-decent relations from his neighbor. And then my father was the second black man to build a house in that neighborhood. We built a house right across the street in 1955, and that's the house I grew up in. I don't recall having any trouble with the neighbors for that reason, just for the blacks. My father was very well known and very well respected. He was the first black assistant county attorney in Iowa and his first black criminal prosecutor. So he, and of course, with his military service, he was very well respected, and his father was very well respected. So while we did have some threats when he was working to desegregate the western suburbs, getting blacks to be able to buy houses in certain areas of Des Moines where they were redlined, we got some death threats from that. But other than that, we grew up pretty good. I mean, it was the civil rights period.
Now, the first Tuskegee man killed was an Iowan? Maurice Smokey?
Yeah. There's a group picture of him.
Was from Webster City.
Yeah. There's a group picture of him in there.
Yeah, I did not know that.
He was killed over Yugoslavia. His plane went down. He apparently had been able to get out of the plane and had inflated his raft, but the seas were very rough. And a big wave came in, and they just washed him down and drowned him. He was the first Tuskegee Airman killed in combat, but he would not be the last. I think there were 60 black men that lost their lives flying for America during the war. You talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. My oldest brother's godfather, Luther Smith, who was from Des Moines, he was one of the original Tuskegee Airmen with the 99th Pursuit Squadron out of North Africa in 1943. He spent some time in a German Luftstalag at the end of the war. His plane was disabled in a strafing run over Czechoslovakia. The Germans captured him and put him in a Luftstalag. He got out and became the first black aerospace engineer hired by General Electric in 1951. My first black male teacher at junior high school in Des Moines, Iowa, Franklin Junior High, was a black man just back from Vietnam in the Marine Corps. He'd been shot 9 times in an ambush by the North Vietnamese, and he survived. He's still alive today. He's getting ready to retire as a high school teacher in Atlanta, Georgia.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir.
God bless you, and hope to be working with you soon. Take care.